The Lord's Supper. Hello, 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 my friend. This is Clyde. For the last 4 days, we have been talking about something important in the Christian community. Jesus instructed his disciples sometime between his resurrection and his ascension about something important. He knew that the church would emerge shortly after his departure, and he had an idea of what that would look like. The disciples would preach the gospel and people would get saved. Then they were to baptize the new converts. And after that, the disciples would embark on a program of teaching new converts to obey all those things Jesus had taught the disciples during the years that they were with him. There is one big item that Jesus emphasized, and today I would invite us to look at that: the Lord's Supper. Jesus demonstrated this to the disciples and then concluded by telling them to do this in remembrance of him. So let us dive in. As you might remember, Jesus and his disciples were in Jerusalem for the annual festival of the Passover, which went on for a week. There was a special night that was designated as the time for the Jews to reenact the Passover meal that represented the great departure of the Hebrew nation from slavery in Egypt. Well, this is what happened the night Jesus and his disciples were having that meal. What I'm about to describe is recorded in Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22. They had just finished eating the Passover meal when, without any announcement, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it and gave it to the guys and said, "Take it. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He then took a cup full of wine and gave thanks and passed it around to them and told them that the cup represents the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. That was what Jesus did the night before his crucifixion, and in that simple, brief event, Jesus established an important ordinance of the Christian church, which we now call communion, or the Lord's Supper. This was one of the many teachings of Jesus that the disciples were then asked to teach new converts: the Lord's Supper, or Holy Communion, or Holy Eucharist. Well, did they? Did the disciples really teach new converts this? In the book of Acts of the Apostles, there are numerous instances where the members of the early church would do communion as frequently as daily, sometimes when they gathered in the temple courts, or later when they had special gatherings on Sundays. This is evidence that the disciples did not only teach new converts about this great event, but they reenacted it often enough, maybe as frequently as once a week, or probably even more times. Well, it did not end there, because in 1 Corinthians 11 we read what the Apostle Paul received from the Lord and eventually passed it on to the new believers in the city of Corinth. The Apostle Paul's account is similar to the gospel accounts, with one statement: "For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26. Communion is a simple act of worship and celebration of the sacrificial death Jesus experienced. Down through the centuries, there has been this question: how often should communion, or Lord's Supper, take place? If you search the three gospel accounts and Paul's account in 1 Corinthians 11, you will never find a hint or a suggestion of frequency. I grew up in a small evangelical church, for example, and communion was done every Sunday. There are some churches who do communion weekly, some monthly, some quarterly, and some even once a year. From my experience, communion has always been seen as very special. Back in those days, the person who administered the communion would break the loaf of white bread in two halves and send it around the congregation, and folks would break a piece of the bread. Likewise, someone would pray over the wine and the ushers would distribute the cup to the members. Now, with all the health concerns and the spreading of germs, most churches now use a mini cup with a cap that covers a wafer, and that in turn covers the wine, thus reducing the possibility of spreading germs among each other. The reality is that Jesus did not suggest a frequency, and neither did Paul. This feast, the Lord's Supper, is the one activity in which everyone who participates do so on their understanding that the frequency or occurrence of this event does not devalue the significance of it. Jesus simply states that it represents his death, and he has promised that he will not drink of the fruit of the vine, which is wine, until all Christians join him around the great throne in heaven. Based on what Paul wrote, is that each person must not take communion, however, with any unconfessed sin in their life. Thus we understand that communion, or the Lord's Supper, or the Holy Eucharist, is a direct celebration of the death of Jesus that brought us salvation. I enjoy this celebration of Jesus' death, whether in church or at home. It is too special to be treated with scant regard. Well, thank you for hanging out with us today, and we trust that this lesson on the Lord's Supper would have been useful to you. If so, then hit the like button below, and then hit share and send this message on to some friends of yours. Finally, hit the subscribe tab, and that will ensure that you get this daily message delivered straight into your inbox. Until then, have a blessed day in Jesus.